The file begins, not with a birth or a first-hit record, but with the sound of helicopter blades beating against a pale Miami sky. March 2026. The raid was not an attack, it was a public autopsy. Federal agents in tactical gear moved through the waterfront estate with the grim efficiency of undertakers. They weren't just seizing hard drives and phones. They were performing an inventory of sins. The empire, built on beats and champagne and the relentless branding of a lifestyle, was being dismantled piece by piece on live television. The public watched, stunned. The man who sold them the dream of invincibility was now just a name on a search warrant. His fortress of concrete and glass, once a monument to success, suddenly looked like a very expensive cage. The anatomy of a fall had commenced. The raids tore open the dam. What followed was not a trickle of accusations, but a deluge. The lawsuits began to pile up, each document a new chapter in a harrowing testimony that had been whispered for years. The claims were a catalog of abuse, painting a portrait of a predator hiding in plain sight. One civil suit, filed in early 2026, was particularly venomous. A man named Steve Otis alleged he was drugged and assaulted. But the core of his claim was not the act itself, but the threat that followed. A threat that reached back decades into the very mythology of hip-hop's bloodiest feud. According to the filing, Combs's warning was chillingly direct. If I could take out Tupac, what do you think could happen to you? It was a fatal mistake. The ghost of 1996 had been summoned, and it attached itself to the growing list of Combs's alleged crimes. His initial denials were loud, but they sounded like paper tearing against the weight of accumulating evidence. To understand the collapse, one must first audit the construction. The blueprints for the Combs empire were not drafted in a boardroom. They were scrawled in the margins of a life that began in Harlem, in the shadow of a ghost. His father, Melvin Combs, was an associate of a narcotics syndicate, a life erased by street violence when Sean was only 2. This became the original sin, the inheritance he would spend a lifetime trying to outrun. He ran on pure, uncut ambition. Howard University was a launchpad, not a classroom. He ran party promotions that became legendary, small-scale empires of velvet rope and bass. He talked his way into an internship at Uptown Records, a mailroom ghost who haunted the executives until they saw him. Andre Harrell saw the hunger. The kid didn't just want a job, he wanted the throne. He learned the machinery of the industry from the inside. He learned how to manufacture desire. Then came a premonition of the chaos to follow. A charity event in 1991. Overcrowding. A stampede. 9 people dead. That was the first inventory of tragedy tied to his name. A dark baptism. He was fired, but it was not an exile. It was the catalyst. From the wreckage of that disaster, he founded Bad Boy Records. The name itself a confession, a promise, a brand built on the very edge he was forced to walk. Bad Boy was not a record label, it was a weather system. It changed the cultural climate. Combs wasn't selling music, he was selling a lifestyle. A fantasy of ascension, lacquered in platinum and drenched in champagne. The aesthetic was defiant luxury. The shiny suit era, he found his centerpiece, his heavyweight champion, in Christopher Wallace. The notorious B.I.G. Their partnership was the engine of the empire. Biggie had the voice, a flow like liquid concrete. Combs had the vision. He polished the raw talent until it gleamed, creating a sound that dominated the airwaves. It was the soundtrack of the mid-90s. The hits were relentless. An assembly line of gold and platinum plaques. The empire expanded. A clothing line. Restaurants. He wasn't just on the charts. He was the chart. This was the peak. The view from the top of a mountain of money and influence. But the shine was blinding. It cast long, dark shadows where rivals gathered. And the higher the ascent, the more brutal the laws of gravity become. The entire structure was built on the charisma of one man and the life of another. A foundation that was already beginning to crack. The cracks became fissures, then chasms. For years, the whispers were just background noise, the cost of doing business at the summit of power. But now, those whispers were being notarized. The first lawsuits were dismissed as extortion, the desperate ploys of the envious. But they kept coming. A slow, steady drip of allegations that soon became a torrent. A paper avalanche threatening to bury the entire estate. This was the anatomy of the fall, catalogued in civil complaints. The allegations sketched a horrifying pattern, a blueprint of control. The stories were different, but the architecture of the abuse was the same. In isolation, intoxication, intimidation. The glamour of the parties became a gilded cage. The champagne, a chemical leash. And then a new filing landed on the pile. A man named Steve Otis. His claim was different. It reached back through the years, connecting the rot of the present to the ghosts of the past. He alleged a sexual assault in 2012, but the core of the suit wasn't the act itself. It was the threat that followed, a chilling reference to the murder of Tupac Shakur. If I could get rid of Tupac, what do you think could happen to you? The words hung in the legal filing like a death sentence. The old conspiracy theory was no longer a fringe rumor. It was now Exhibit A in a civil case, a potential motive, a testament to a long history of impunity. The empire wasn't just built on charisma, it was built on silence. Silence is a commodity. It can be bought for a time, but data is eternal. The fatal mistake, the Rokovaya Oshibka, wasn't a business deal or a bad investment. It was a digital ghost, captured by the unblinking eye of a security camera. For years it was a myth, a piece of hotel lobby lore. Then it materialized. The footage was grainy, stripped of all glamour. It showed not a mogul, but a predator. A brutal, liminal dance of violence in a hallway. The man in the shiny suits was gone, replaced by a figure of pure, unrestrained rage. The video didn't just support the accuser's claims, it became the visual centerpiece for all of them. It was the Rosetta Stone for translating years of whispers. Every denial he had ever issued crumbled to dust against this silent, looping testament. Then came the chorus of the damned, former associates, producers, bodyguards, men who had stood in his shadow for decades, now stepping into the light to perform a posthumous audit of his character. Their testimonies, featured in a documentary produced by his rival 50 Cent, filled in the gaps. They spoke of a bunker mentality, of paranoia and control, of a court where the king's mood was law. The evidence was no longer just he said, she said. It was a mosaic of corroboration. The video provided the act. The testimonies provided the motive and the method. The verdict was becoming a formality. The sentence had already been passed by the court of public record, written on 1 million screens in the cold, unforgiving light of a leaked video file. The video file became Exhibit A in a legal proceeding that was less a trial and more an autopsy. Pause. Combs' defense team, a collection of the most expensive legal minds money could buy, attempted a classic maneuver: containment. Their strategy was to build firewalls between the 70 civil suits, treating each accusation as an isolated brushfire instead of the raging inferno it had become. They moved to discredit, to delay, to bury prosecutors in procedural paperwork, a blizzard of motions, a mountain of filings. The goal was to make justice too expensive, too exhausting for his accusers. But the prosecution performed its own inventory of sins. They linked the cases, weaving a narrative not of isolated incidents, but of a systemic, decades-long enterprise. The key ruling came in early 2025. The judge allowed testimony from multiple accusers in the same trial, a legal decision that transformed the courtroom into a stage for a Greek chorus of ghosts. Pause. Each story reinforced the others. The defense's firewalls crumbled into dust. The trial was no longer about one night, one victim. It was the anatomy of a reign. Then came the bitter testament. The fortress of loyalty, built on bad boy checks and the intoxicating proximity to power, finally collapsed. The documentary produced by Curtis Jackson wasn't just revenge. It was a platform for the palace guard to confess. Their motivations were a cocktail of guilt, self-preservation, and the quiet satisfaction of watching a tyrant fall. For years, they were the keepers of the bunker's shadow, the men who cleaned up the messes and enforced the silence. One former producer spoke of the audition process for new female artists, a term that hung in the air like poison gas. A bodyguard described the loyalty tests, rituals of humiliation designed to bind employees to their king through shared secrets. They didn't just corroborate the accusations, they provided the texture, the smell of the room, the sound of the lock turning. They were performing a posthumous audit on a living man, and their testimony was the final, unforgivable invoice for decades of complicity. Pause. Their words were the nails in his custom-made coffin. The hammer fell in July 2025. Not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of a court clerk reading a verdict. 2 counts of trafficking. The more severe charges evaporated, but it didn't matter. The armor was pierced. His legacy, once written in gold leaf, was now just a smudge on a case file. The anatomy of the fall accelerated. His Gulfstream, the steel chariot of his imperial phase, was sold off. Not for cash flow, for optics. A desperate attempt to look like a man liquidating an empire, not a predator selling his tools. But then came the ghost. A new civil suit from a man named Pause, Steve Otis. It wasn't just another story of abuse from the archives. It was a new, darker vein of rot. The lawsuit contained an allegation that felt like a curse exhumed from a shallow grave. A threat whispered years ago, linking Combs to the murder of Pause Tupac Shakur. It was no longer just about sex and power. It was about a different kind of debt, one that the culture had been trying to collect for 3 decades. The King's Bunker had a secret sub-basement. October 2025, the sentencing, 50 months. The number was almost meaningless. The real sentence was the erasure, the transition from Pause, Sean Combs, the icon, to an inmate number, a digital ghost in a federal database. This was the final chapter in the inventory of his sins. The man who built an empire on sound was now sentenced to silence. His future was a calendar of concrete walls and scheduled meals, a bitter epilogue to a life lived without limits. The 70 civil suits remain, a long, grim procession of mutilated fates, each one a receipt for his ambition. His legacy is not the music or the fashion, it's a legal precedent, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and green rooms about how quickly a throne can become a defendant's chair. There is no redemption arc here, only the cold, mathematical outcome of a posthumous audit performed on a living man. The empire is gone. The sycophants are gone. Pause. All that's left is the man, alone with the wreckage, in a quiet room where the champagne never arrives,